Hi, this is Champlet 2 on the PlayStation Network. I'm going to take you on a tour inside the mansions to show you all 72 possible decor, tint, and pattern combinations so you can decide which one you like best. I'll give you a quick peek at all the spaces where there are both tints and patterns, and it may only have a few seconds in each space, but you can pause for a closer look. There are chapters in the description below so you can jump ahead to the design options you want to see. We'll start with the Los Santos Loft decor and we'll visit all 4 tints and 6 pattern combinations, starting with Tint 1, which is basically white, and the first pattern, which is sort of a palm frond design. Here in the office you can see the pattern on the wall as well as the tint. Here's a look at the dining room. And here's the living room. Now we're in the master bedroom with the wallpaper there behind the bed, and in addition to the tint and the wallpaper pattern in the bedroom. Still in the Los Santos loft with the first white tint, here is pattern 2. And there's pattern 2 in the office with tint 1, and in the dining room with pattern 2 and tint 1. Here's pattern 2 and tint 1 in the living room, and pattern 2 with tint 1 in the master bedroom. You can see it's a little darker, a little later at night now, and that changes the hues just a little bit. Still in the Los Santos loft style, here is tint 1 with pattern 3, which appears to be kissing lips. There's the pattern in the office, pattern 3 with tint 1. And here in the dining room you can see the pattern gets maybe just a tiny bit darker when it's dark outside. And in the living room with pattern 3 and tint 1. Now we're back in the loft decor with pattern 3, tint 1 in the master bedroom. In the Los Santos loft style, again still with tint 1, this is the 4th pattern. There's the pattern in the office, along with the tint. Pattern 4 in the dining room. Here's tint 1 and pattern 4 in the living room. There's pattern 4 in the master bedroom and the Los Santos loft. Let's check out pattern 5 with tint 1 in the Los Santos loft decor. There it is in the office with pattern 5. There's our happy zebras making baby zebras. In the dining room, there's pattern 5 with tint 1 in the living room. I think pattern 5, more than the rest of them, sort of has a reflective look to it, like you can see as I turn it kind of shimmers on the wall. That's something to consider. And here it is in the master bedroom. And lastly, for the Los Santos loft style, here is tint 1 with pattern 6. And here's pattern 6 in the office with tint 1. Pattern 6 and tint 1 in the dining room. Tint 1 and pattern 6 in the living room. What's kind of neat about pattern 6 is if you're looking at it this way, you sort of see the cross in the middle. But then here in the master bedroom, when I turn around, if you look at it from a distance, now what you see is really sort of the inverse. You see it's almost like a big circle. But then as you walk closer to it, now the cross becomes more visible. That's interesting. Now we're looking at the Los Santos loft decor with Tint 2, which is kind of a seafoam green, but you'll notice that the patterns now take on sort of a pink or a mauve color, and this is pattern 1 with Tint 2. Here's the pattern 1 with Tint 2 in the office. Here in the dining room, looking at pattern 1 with Tint 2 in the living room with Tint 2 and pattern 1. Here's the master bedroom with pattern 1 and Tint 2. With Tint 2 and pattern 2 has a little more design in it, a little darker design, so it looks a little bit less pink. Here in the office, it's also important to think about how this looks with each of the decor options, like the wallpaper having that sort of pink color to it, mixed with the stone look of the loft design. Might look better with the wood. We'll see that shortly. Here's a peek at the dining room with pattern 2 and Tint 2. So think about the color of the furniture in each of the decor options, along with the pattern and the tint. We're back in the master bedroom with pattern 2 and Tint 2. Now we'll take a look at Tint 2 with pattern 3 in the Los Santos Loft design. Got the pattern on the wall there, pattern 3 and Tint 2. Back in the dining room again with pattern 3. And here in the living room with pattern 3 and Tint 2. Back in the master bedroom here with pattern 3 and Tint 2. Here's pattern 4 with Tint 2 in the Los Santos Loft decor. And again, because it has a little more of a pattern, a little more of a contrast, it takes on a slightly different shade of pink, kind of more of a grayish pink. And there's the wall in the office with pattern 4 and Tint 2. And a look at pattern 4 with Tint 2 in the dining room. And here's Tint 2 with pattern 4 in the living room. Back in the master bedroom, there's pattern 4 with Tint 2. Here's Tint 2 with pattern 5 in the Los Santos Loft decor. And here's a peek in the office, pattern 5 with Tint 2. Tint 2 with pattern 5 in the dining room. And pattern 5 with Tint 2 in the living room. Once again back in the master bedroom with pattern 5 and Tint 2. And lastly, for Tint 2, here is pattern 6 in the Los Santos Loft decor. Back in the office, there's pattern 6 with Tint 2 in the dining room. And Tint 2 with pattern 6 in the living room. Honestly, I hadn't paid much attention to this pattern 6 before. I didn't have it in any of my houses, but I really do like, I'm now recognizing while I'm making this video how cool it is that it looks like circles from here, but as you get closer you see the crosses instead of the circles. I think that's really neat. Here's a look at Tint 3, which is sort of a lavender color with pattern 1, and again with the lavender, the patterns have sort of a pink color to them. Here in the office, there's pattern 1 with Tint 3. Here in the dining room, can't say I'm too crazy about the color of those curtains over there next to that pink for pattern 1 and Tint 3. Actually, pattern 1 and tint 3 don't look half bad here in the Los Santos design with the gray couch. Here's pattern 1 in the master bedroom and with tint 3. Let's take a look at tint 3 with pattern 2, which again is a little bit darker. It's still that same sort of pink, but has more dark gray in it, so it gives it sort of a more gray feel. And the office, there's the pattern. Hello, Merle. And the tint. Passing through the dining room with pattern 2 and tint 3. We'll check out the living room here with pattern 2 and tint 3. There's pattern 2 with tint 3 in the master. Continuing with tint 3 in the Los Santos Loft style, here is pattern 3. Pattern 3 and tint 3. From the dining room, here's tint 3 and pattern 3. I wish they had made maybe the pattern color could have been different for this tint. It seems very similar to the tint 2 pattern color. Here in the living room, there's tint 3 and pattern 3. Downstairs again in the master bedroom, there's pattern 3 with tint 3. As you've heard me mention before, here with pattern 4, there's a lot more gray in it, so it's significantly darker than some of the other patterns. Here with tint 3. Another look in the office here with pattern 4 and tint 3. There's tint 3 and pattern 4 in the dining room. And see, now the curtain's a little less ugly next to that pattern because the pattern's a little darker. Tint 3 with pattern 4 in the living room. Here's pattern 4 again with tint 3 in the master bedroom. Let's check out pattern 5 now with tint 3. There it is, pattern 5 in the office with tint 3. There's tint 3 and pattern 5 in the dining room. And tint 3 and pattern 5 in the living room. Here in the master bedroom, we're looking at pattern 5 with tint 3. And bearing in mind it is daytime, these all do look maybe a little bit darker when it's dark outside. For our last look at tint 3 here with pattern 6, it is dark outside, so you can see the tint 3 is a little warmer when it's dark outside. And there's pattern 6. And here in the office, there's pattern 6 with tint 3. Also in the dining room, pattern 6 and tint 3. Here we are in the living room where it's a little brighter with tint 3 and pattern 6. Down in the master bedroom, here is pattern 6 with tint 3. Finally, we've made it to tint 4 for the Los Santos Loft decor. And it's sort of an interesting shade of pink, almost a bubblegum pink, but not quite that pale. And here's pattern 1, so you can see there's a green hue to the patterns with tint 4. Now we're in the office taking a look at pattern 1 with that green hue with tint 4. Here's the dining room with tint 4 and pattern 1. Here's the living room with tint 4 and pattern 1. Here's the master bedroom with pattern 1 and tint 4. So now we're looking at tint 4 with pattern 2. And again, because it has a lot more darker contrast in it, it sort of takes on a slightly different hue of green. I only just noticed as I was walking here in the office that you can actually see the tint color right down there at the bottom near the floor in the office. I've never noticed that before. But there's the pattern 2 with tint 4 and pattern 2 with tint 4 in the dining room. Check out the living room with tint 4 and pattern 2. As we take a look here in the master at pattern 2 and tint 4, I don't know why they wouldn't have let me maybe have this color on the pattern with, say, the lavender tint. That would have been maybe a little better, but that's not an option. Now with tint 4 and pattern 3, you'll notice it's a little bit darker green than we have seen with the other ones. So that's not bad. And here's pattern 3 with tint 4 in the office. Quick look at the dining room with tint 4 and pattern 3. And a quick glance in the living room with tint 4 and pattern 3. Here's the Los Santos Loft Master with pattern 4 and nope, that's pattern 3. Sorry, that's pattern 3 and tint 4. Now here's tint 4 with pattern 4, and as you can see, pattern 4 is noticeably darker. There's pattern 4 with tint 4, and here's the dining room with pattern 4 and tint 4. Here's a look at the living room with pattern 4 and tint 4. And now we're back down in the master bedroom with pattern 4 and tint 4. Here's a look at tint 4 with pattern 5. There's pattern 5 on the wall and tint 4. And pattern 5 with tint 4 in the dining room. Here's the living room with pattern 5 and tint 4. Here's pattern 5 with tint 4 in the master bedroom. Here's one last option for the Los Santos Loft decor with tint 4 and pattern 6. Here's the office with pattern 6 and tint 4. Another look at pattern 6 with tint 4 in the dining room. Here's a peek at the living room with pattern 6 and tint 4. Now we're checking out the master bedroom with pattern 6 and tint 4. Next we're going to get into the San Andreas coastal decor and all of the 4 tint and 6 pattern combinations, beginning with tint 1, which is white, and pattern 1. There's pattern 1 and tint 1 in the dining room now with tint 1 and pattern 1. Here's the living room with tint 1 and pattern 1. And there's pattern 1 and tint 1 in the master bedroom. Still in the San Andreas coastal design, we have the white tint 1 and pattern 2. And pattern 2 with tint 1 in the office. There's pattern 2 with tint 1 in the dining room. And this is tint 1 with pattern 2 in the living room. In the master bedroom, here's a look at pattern 2 with tint 1. Next, we'll take a look at Tint 1 with Pattern 3 in the San Andreas Coastal. There's Pattern 3 and Tint 1 in the office. Pattern 3 and Tint 1 in the dining room. There's Pattern 3 with Tint 1 in the living room. Back in the master bedroom, here's Pattern 3 with Tint 1. In San Andreas Coastal decor, here's Tint 1 with Pattern 4. And notice it's got a lot more contrast, so it looks a little darker. In the office, here's Pattern 4 with Tint 1. There's Tint 1 and Pattern 4 in the dining room. And Tint 1 with Pattern 4 in the living room. And here is Pattern 4 with Tint 1 in the master bedroom. Still in San Andreas Coastal decor, here is Tint 1 with Pattern 5. We're back in the office with Pattern 5 and Tint 1. We'll take a peek at the dining room here with Pattern 5 and Tint 1. There's the living room with Tint 1 and Pattern 5. That's Pattern 5 with Tint 1 in the master bedroom. The final pattern option for Tint 1 in San Andreas Coastal here is Pattern 6. There's Pattern 6 and Tint 1 in the office. Here's the dining room with Tint 1 and Pattern 6. And the living room with Tint 1 and Pattern 6. In the master bedroom, here is Pattern 6 with Tint 1. Next, in the San Andreas Coastal design, we'll look at Tint 2, which is kind of a soft green, with Pattern 1 that has sort of a pink tone to it. In the office, there is Pattern 1 with Tint 2. There's Tint 2 with Pattern 1 in the dining room. Here's a look at Tint 2 with Pattern 1 in the living room. In the master bedroom, there is Pattern 1 with Tint 2. Now we'll look at Tint 2 with Pattern 2 in the San Andreas Coastal design. Pattern 2 with Tint 2 in the office. And a quick peek of the dining room with Tint 2 and Pattern 2. And the living room with Tint 2 and Pattern 2. Keep in mind it's now dark outside in the game. Here is Pattern 2 with Tint 2 in the bedroom, and both are a little bit darker because it's dark outside. In the San Andreas Coastal, here is Tint 2 with Pattern 3. Take a look at the office here with Pattern 3 and Tint 2. This is Pattern 3 and Tint 2 in the dining room. And the living room with Tint 2 and Pattern 3. In the master bedroom, it's still dark outside, but there's Pattern 3 with Tint 2, so maybe a little darker. Now we'll take a tour through the San Andreas Coastal design with Tint 2 and Pattern 4. In the office, there's Pattern 4 with Tint 2. Now in the dining room, there's Tint 2 with Pattern 4. And the living room with Tint 2 and Pattern 4. And that's Pattern 4 with Tint 2 in the master bedroom. Here is Tint 2 with Pattern 5 in the San Andreas Coastal decor. That's Pattern 5 with Tint 2 in the office. And the dining room with Pattern 5 and Tint 2. We'll pass through the living room with Tint 2 and Pattern 5. And one more look at Pattern 5 with Tint 2 in the master bedroom. Finally, for Tint 2 in the San Andreas Coastal, the last pattern option is pattern 6. Here's pattern 6 with Tint 2 in the office. This is the dining room with pattern 6 and Tint 2. Here's the living room with Tint 2 and pattern 6. As the sun is coming up, I just wanted to remind you with pattern 6, as you're closer to it, the thing that seems most obvious are the kind of lighter patterned crosses in the middle. And then when you're further away, there's Tint 2, but now what you notice more is the dark circles between the crosses. That's just really cool. Switching to Tint 3, which is this sort of lavender shade, in the San Andreas Coastal, there is pattern 1. That's pattern 1 with Tint 3 in the office. And the dining room with Tint 3 and pattern 1. Here's Tint 3 with pattern 1 in the living room. And in the bedroom, here is pattern 1 with Tint 3. Let's take a tour with pattern 2 and Tint 3 in the San Andreas Coastal. In the office, there's pattern 2 and Tint 3. That's Tint 3 and pattern 2 in the dining room. And the living room with Tint 3 and pattern 2. Downstairs in the master, there is pattern 2 with Tint 3. Here's a tour of Tint 3 with pattern 3. This is the office with pattern 3 and Tint 3. Passing through the dining room with Tint 3 and pattern 3. And the living room with pattern 3 and Tint 3. Downstairs in the master with pattern 3 and Tint 3. Still in the San Andreas Coastal design, we have Tint 3 with pattern 4, and notice that pattern 4 has more contrast, therefore it's much more gray than just pink. I think I might like the look of pattern 4 the best in the office. And there it is with Tint 3. There's pattern 4 and Tint 3 in the dining room. Tint 3 with pattern 4 in the living room. And the master bedroom with pattern 4 and Tint 3. We're walking through Tint 3 with pattern 5 in the San Andreas Coastal decor. That's pattern 5 with Tint 3 in the office. Pattern 5 and Tint 3 in the dining room. The living room with Tint 3 and pattern 5. That's pattern 5 and Tint 3. Pattern 6 is the last option here for Tint 3 with the San Andreas Coastal design. I mentioned earlier that I really liked pattern 4 in the office, but pattern 6 is pretty good too. With Tint 3. Here's the dining room with Tint 3 and pattern 6. Honestly, let me get back here. It kind of takes on a different shade of purple here in the dining room as opposed to pink. That's not bad. And there's the living room with Tint 3 and pattern 6. As I mentioned a moment ago in the dining room, there's something about this particular pattern 6 that it takes on a little bit more of a purple tone. So it looks good with the lavender here in the master bedroom. Now let's look at Tint 4 in the San Andreas Coastal design with pattern 1, which now the patterns have sort of a green color with the pink tint. Here's the office with pattern 1 and Tint 4. And the living room with Tint 4 and pattern 1. I've been calling this tint pink, but I guess some people might call it rose, maybe. but that's tint 4 and pattern 1. Back in the master bedroom, there is pattern 1 with tint 4 in the San Andreas Coastal. The next step on our tour will be pattern 2 with tint 4 and the San Andreas Coastal decor. Well, you know, pattern 2 looks pretty good in the office too, with tint 4. In the dining room, there's tint 4 and pattern 2. And pattern 2 has a little more contrast, so it makes it a little bit darker. That's pattern 2 with tint 4 in the living room. It's getting a little darker outside, which seems to impact the bedroom quite a bit. The pattern 2 with tint 4. It shows up a little darker, especially in the bedroom with all those windows. As we're starting out here in the San Andreas Coastal design with tint 4 and pattern 3, it is dark outside now, so the tint 4 does definitely look darker when it's dark outside. Here's pattern 3 with tint 4 in the office. The dining room with tint 4 and pattern 3. Here's pattern 3 with tint 4 in the living room. May I just say, as I'm in the bedroom here looking at pattern 3 with tint 4, I sincerely hope they get people with a little bit better color and design style in GTA 6. Just saying. As we take a look at tint 4 with pattern 4 in the San Andreas Coastal, it's about midnight, so it's getting dark outside. Well, it's very dark outside. In the office, there's pattern 4 and tint 4. There's the dining room with tint 4 and pattern 4. Even though it is dark outside, the tint is very bright in the living room. And pattern 4. Tint 4 and pattern 4. In the master, there is pattern 4 with tint 4, and it's quite dark outside, so the patterns and tints look dark. Let's check out pattern 5 with tint 4 with the San Andreas Coastal decor. Here's the office with pattern 5 and tint 4. Glancing through the dining room with tint 4 and pattern 5. And the living room with pattern 5 and tint 4. So that's pattern 5 and tint 4 in the master. The final combination for the San Andreas Coastal design is tint 4 with pattern 6. Here's the office with pattern 6 and tint 4. Pattern 6 and tint 4 in the dining room. As I'm entering the living room, as I've mentioned before, when you're at a distance, you notice the circles in pattern 6. Passing by tint 4, and then the lighter cross in the middle becomes more visible as you get closer. Last but not least, for the San Andreas Coastal design, here is pattern 6 and tint 4. We'll take a look at the 4 tint colors and 6 patterns in the Vinewood Regency decor. So this is tint 1 with pattern 1. And there's pattern 1 and tint 1 in the office. And this is pattern 1 and tint 1 in the dining room. Here's tint 1 and pattern 1 in the living room. And here is pattern 1 with tint 1 in the master. In the Vinewood Regency decor again, here is tint 1 with pattern 2. Pattern 2 with tint 1 in the office. Here's tint 1 and pattern 2 in the dining room. And the living room with tint 1 and pattern 2. As night begins to fall outside, there is pattern 2 and tint 1 in the master bedroom. Here is Tint 1 with pattern 3 in the Vinewood Regency decor. Here's pattern 3 with Tint 1 in the office. Pattern 3 with Tint 1 in the dining room. The living room with Tint 1 and pattern 3. In the master bedroom, as night is falling, there is pattern 3 and Tint 1. Here in the Vinewood Regency decor, there's Tint 1, now with pattern 4, which again has more contrast, so it's a little darker. Pattern 4 there with Tint 1 in the office. Here's the dining room with pattern 4 and Tint 1. Passing through the living room with Tint 1 and pattern 4. And here you'd wake up in the bedroom with pattern 4 and Tint 1. Now we'll take a look at pattern 5 with Tint 1 in the Vinewood Regency decor. There's pattern 5 with Tint 1 in the office. Here's the dining room with Tint 1 and pattern 5. And the living room with pattern 5 and Tint 1. Here in the master bedroom, when it's dark outside, there is pattern 5 with Tint 1. The final pattern for Tint 1 is pattern 6 in the Vinewood Regency decor. There's pattern 6 with Tint 1 in the office. Here's the dining room at night with Tint 1 and pattern 6, and the living room with Tint 1 and pattern 6. Downstairs in the master bedroom, there is pattern 6 with Tint 1. Still in the Vinewood Regency decor, here is Tint 2, now with pattern 1. So we've got the green walls, but the patterns are kind of pinkish. That's pattern 1 with Tint 2 in the office. And pattern 1 and Tint 2 in the dining room. Here's the living room with Tint 2 and pattern 1. And here is the master bedroom with pattern 1 and Tint 2. Looking at Vinewood Regency with Tint 2 again, here is pattern 2. That's pattern 2 with Tint 2 in the office. The dining room with Tint 2 and pattern 2. The living room with Tint 2 and pattern 2. The master bedroom with pattern 2 and Tint 2. Now we'll go through Vinewood Regency with Tint 2 and pattern 3. Here's the office with pattern 3 and Tint 2. There's Tint 2 and pattern 3 in the dining room. Tint 2 and pattern 3 in the living room. As the sun is coming up, here is pattern 3 with Tint 2 in the master bedroom. This is Tint 2 with pattern 4 in the Vinewood Regency decor. There's pattern 4 with Tint 2 in the office. Pattern 4 and Tint 2 in the dining room. Here's the living room with Tint 2 and pattern 4. And pattern 4 with Tint 2 in the master bedroom. In the Vinewood Regency decor, we will look at Tint 2 with pattern 5. Here's pattern 5 with Tint 2 in the office. Quick look at the dining room with Tint 2 and pattern 5. That's the living room with Tint 2 and pattern 5. And now in the daylight, there is pattern 5 with Tint 2 in the master bedroom. Final pattern option for Tint 2 is pattern 6 in the Vinewood Regency decor. Here's pattern 6 with Tint 2 in the office. The dining room with tint 2 and pattern 6. There's the living room with tint 2 and pattern 6. There is pattern 6 with tint 2 in the master bedroom. Now we're going to tour the Vinewood Regency design with tint 3, which is sort of lavender, and the patterns have sort of a pink color to them now, and that's pattern 1. There's pattern 1 with tint 3. Again, pattern 1 with tint 3 in the dining room. Check out the living room here with tint 3 and pattern 1. And pattern 1 with tint 3 in the master bedroom. Vinewood Regency Decor, we'll take a look at tint 3 with pattern 2, it's got more contrast, it's a little darker. In the office, there's pattern 2 with tint 3. Next, we're in the dining room with pattern 2 and tint 3. There's the living room with pattern 2 and tint 3. Lastly, here's the master bedroom with pattern 2 and tint 3. Next tour for the Vinewood Regency Decor, here is tint 3 with pattern 3. Pattern 3 and tint 3 in the office. In the dining room, here is tint 3 and pattern 3. That's pattern 3 and tint 3 in the living room. And downstairs, here is pattern 3 with tint 3 in the master bedroom. In the Vinewood Regency Decor is tint 3 with pattern 4. Here's pattern 4 with tint 3 in the office. Here's tint 3 with pattern 4 in the dining room, and tint 3 with pattern 4 in the living room. This is pattern 4 with tint 3 in the master bedroom. Here's the Vinewood Regency Decor with pattern 5 and tint 3. Passing through the office, there's pattern 5 and tint 3. Here's the dining room with tint 3 and pattern 5. Tint 3 and pattern 5 in the living room. That's pattern 5 with tint 3 in the master bedroom. For tint 3 in the Vinewood Regency Decor, here is pattern 6. That's pattern 6 with tint 3 in the office. In the dining room, here is tint 3 and pattern 6. This is tint 3 and pattern 6 in the living room. Back downstairs in the master bedroom, there is pattern 6 with tint 3. One more tint option. This is tint 4 in the Vinewood Regency Decor with pattern 1. So when the tint is that kind of pink, the pattern is green. We're here in the office with pattern 1 and tint 4. In the dining room, here is tint 4 with pattern 1. There's tint 4 and pattern 1 in the living room. As the sun begins to set, there is pattern 1 with tint 4 in the master bedroom. Still in the Vinewood Regency Decor, this is tint 4 with pattern 2. Here's a peek at the office with pattern 2 and tint 4. Passing through the dining room with tint 4 and pattern 2. Here's the living room with tint 4 and pattern 2. Now, as it's almost entirely dark outside, there is pattern 2 with tint 4 in the master bedroom. Here's a tour in the Vinewood Regency Decor with tint 4 and pattern 3. This is pattern 3 and tint 4 in the office, and tint 4 with pattern 3 in the dining room. That's the living room with tint 4 and pattern 3. In the dark of night, there is pattern 3 with tint 4 in the master bedroom. Here we are with tint 4 and pattern 4, which again has more contrast, so it's a little darker. And we're still in the Vinewood Regency decor. That's pattern 4 with tint 4 in the office. Here's the dining room with tint 4 and pattern 4. And the living room with tint 4 and pattern 4. That's pattern 4 and tint 4 in the master bedroom. With tint 4, here is pattern 5. That's pattern 5 and tint 4 in the office. Checking out the dining room with tint 4 and pattern 5. Passing through the living room with tint 4 and pattern 5. Again, in the dark of night, there is pattern 5 with tint 4 in the master bedroom. And finally, after 72 combinations, this is the Vinewood Regency decor with tint 4 and pattern 6. There's pattern 6 with tint 4 in the office. The dining room with pattern 6 and tint 4. The living room with tint 4 and pattern 6. And the very last one, the master bedroom with pattern 6 and tint 4 in the Vinewood Regency decor. Thanks so much for watching. A like for the video and a subscription to my channel are always greatly appreciated. Don't forget to check out the link to my Discord channel in the description below. Come by and say hi. See you next time.